13th Sunday in Ordinary Time.
A reading from the Book of Wisdom. God did not make death, nor does he rejoice in the destruction of the living. For he fashioned all things that they might have being, and the creatures of the world are wholesome. And there is not a destructive drug among them, nor any domain of the netherworld on earth, for justice is undying. For God formed man to be imperishable, the image of his own nature he made him. But by the envy of the devil, death entered the world, and they who belong to his company experience it. The word of the Lord.
A reading from the second letter of St. Paul to the Corinthians. Brothers and sisters, as you excel in every respect, in faith, discourse, knowledge, all earnestness, and in the love we have for you, may you excel in this gracious act also. For you know the gracious act of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, for your sake he became poor, so that by his poverty you might become rich. Not that others should have relief while you are burdened, but that as a matter of equality, your abundance at the present time should supply their needs, so that their abundance may also supply your needs, that there may be equality. As it is written, whoever had much did not have more, and whoever had little did not have less. The word of the Lord.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Mark. When Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a large crowd gathered around him, and he stayed close to the sea. One of the synagogue officials, named Jairus, came forward. Seeing him, he fell at his feet and pleaded earnestly with him, saying, "My daughter is at the point of death. Please, come lay your hands on her, that she may get well and live." He went off with him, and a large crowd followed him and pressed upon him, there was a woman afflicted with hemorrhages for 12 years. She had suffered greatly at the hands of many doctors and had spent all that she had. Yet she was not helped, but only grew worse. She had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. She said, "If I but touch his clothes, I shall be cured." Immediately, her flow of blood dried up. She felt in her body that she was healed of her affliction. Jesus, aware at once that power had gone out from him, turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who has touched my clothes?" But his disciples said to Jesus, "You see how the crowd is pressing upon you, and yet you ask, 'Who touched me?'" And he looked around to see who had done it. The woman, realizing what had happened to her, approached in fear and trembling. She fell down before Jesus and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has saved you. Go in peace and be cured of your affliction." While he was still speaking, people from the synagogue official's house arrived and said, "Your daughter has died. Why trouble the teacher any longer?" Disregarding the message that was reported, Jesus said to the synagogue official, "Do not be afraid, just have faith." He did not allow anyone to accompany him inside except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they arrived at the house of the synagogue official, he caught sight of a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. So he went in and said to them, "Why this commotion and weeping? The child is not dead, but asleep." And they ridiculed him. Then he put them all out. He took along the child's father and mother and those who were with him and entered the room where the child was. He took the child by the hand and said to her, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, arise." The girl, a child of 12, arose immediately and walked around. At that they were utterly astounded. He gave strict orders that no one should know this, and said that she should be given something to eat. The Gospel of the Lord.
The first reading comes from the Book of Wisdom, chapter 1, verses 13 to 15, and chapter 2, verses 23 to 24. The Book of Wisdom was one of the last books of the Old Testament to be written. It was only yet written in Greek, so it is not included in the Jewish or the Protestant canon. Remember, the criteria to be accepted in those canons is that it had to be written in Hebrew or Aramaic. It shows the influence of Greek philosophy, and in fact we see that in today's reading. It speaks about the fact that God didn't make any death, anything deadly in the universe. Everything that is death was brought into this universe by the devil. The implication is that Adam and Eve would have lived forever if it hadn't been for their first sin. Now we have to realize this is not the only theory expressed in the Bible. The other theory is that we would have died, except that sin has made death a terrible rending of the fabric of being. That instead, if we had not sinned, death would simply be a twinkling of an eye. 1 second we're here, the next second we're in heaven. We have these two theories expressed. Wisdom especially expresses the idea that sin brought death into the world, something we hear in the letter to the Romans. The second reading is from 2 Corinthians 8, 7, 9, and 13 to 15. This is the passage of the letter where Paul is asking for a contribution, a financial contribution from the community. Remember at the Council of Jerusalem, that meeting between the apostles and Paul and Barnabas, it had been agreed that the Gentile Christians would remember the poor. They were to take up a collection and send it to the poor community of Christians living in Palestine. Well, Paul is recommending to the community that they be generous, that when you have abundance, you're supposed to share it with those who don't have. Just as Jesus did. In the abundance of his love, he shared his love and his life with us. The Gospel is from Mark 5:21 to 43. First of all, the literary structure of this passage is very similar to Mark. He often begins his story. In the middle, he interrupts it with a second story and then goes back to the first one. That's a typical pattern we find all throughout the Gospel of Mark. The beginning of the story is Jesus hears that Jairus' daughter is at the point of death, so he goes to heal her. On the way, he meets a woman who's been afflicted by a hemorrhage. Now, this is the menstrual flow. Remember, in Israel, that made her unclean. She wasn't able to eat meals with her family, go to the synagogue, and this had gone on for 12 years. And she had gone to the doctors, but they hadn't done her any good. All that they had done is taken money away from her. Now, when Luke reports the same passage, he drops that line out about the doctors taking her money. Professional courtesy, malpractice. Here, it mentions that she's tried every natural way to be healed. It hasn't worked. So she touches Jesus. Now, technically, she should not have done that because she's unclean because of the menstrual flow. She has made Jesus unclean. But rather than making Jesus unclean, she has been healed through her faith. In fact, that's exactly what Jesus says. Your faith has saved you. Notice he doesn't say healed you. When there's a miracle where there's no expression of faith, then you simply hear the word healed. When there is an expression of faith, the word used is saved, because the woman is healed not only at a physical level, but also at a spiritual level. Notice too that when the woman touched him, he didn't know who touched him. He looks around to see, and in fact the disciples joke a little bit. Everybody's touching you. It's a crowd. What does this tell us? That Jesus doesn't know everything. He knows enough that he can sacrifice his life and love for our sake, but he doesn't know the lottery numbers for the next 50 years. He doesn't speak Chinese or Mongolian or things like that. And then finally, Jesus goes to the house where the daughter is already dead. Well, he says that she's only asleep, and everybody starts laughing. The people who are laughing are the professional mourners. Because this was an official in the synagogue, he would have had to have a big funeral for his daughter. He would have hired mourners. That's a practice that's still followed in some villages in Ireland today. They weren't emotionally involved, though, so when he says that she's asleep, they burst out laughing. Jesus takes in Peter, James, and John, the three important apostles who always accompany him on very important events, and he says to the girl, Talitha kum, little girl, get up, and she comes back to life. She's not resurrected, she's reanimated. She, the son of the widow of Nain and Lazarus, are reanimated, which means they're come back to life, but someday they would have to die again. The only person in the Gospels resurrected is Jesus, which means he has a glorified body. Talitha kum, the phrase used with this girl, is almost repeated in Acts of the Apostles when Peter raises up Tabitha. In that case, he says Tabitha kum. And notice how similar it sounds. Talitha kum, Tabitha kum. It's so similar because it's a reminder that the apostles continue the work of Jesus after the ascension. And may God bless us.